Hey, you finally found what you were looking for. As you listen to my voice and feel the gentle frequencies in the background, you'll notice your body beginning to sink deeper into your bed. Each breath slower, each muscle softer, and with every word, your thoughts become quieter. You can let go now. You can rest. This is your journey. Welcome to Dreams of Duty. Now, before we begin this journey, take a moment just to breathe. Breathe in slowly. Feel the air fill your chest and breathe out, letting everything go. Again, breathe in and breathe out. Each time, a little deeper, a little calmer. With every breath, your body softens, your thoughts drift further away, and the world outside becomes distant and quiet. You are safe here. You are calm. You are ready to dream. Christmas of 1979. The snow lay thick over the rugged peaks of the Hindu Kush Mountains, a pristine white that belied the ominous rumble of Soviet armor moving across Afghanistan's border. The cold was biting, reaching through the thick wool of coats and the sturdy boots of soldiers trudging across the mountain passes. Helicopters, dark and menacing against the morning sky, scouted ahead, their rotors slicing through the icy wind as they secured the treacherous paths that connected the passes. The air smelled sharply of fuel, oil, and cold metal. Somewhere in the distance, the faint echo of gunfire from border skirmishes hinted at the violence to come. In Moscow, the inner chambers of the Politburo glowed with the subdued light of chandeliers, the ornate walls reflecting decades of imperial and revolutionary history. There, Leonid Ilyich Brezhnev and his closest advisors deliberated over the fate of Afghanistan, a nation whose instability had long threatened to unravel Soviet influence in Central Asia. Afghanistan's communist government, weakened and unpopular, teetered on the brink of collapse, and the Politburo faced a choice: intervene directly, or risk losing yet another state to instability and Western influence. Afghanistan in the 1970s was a land of contrasts. Its history was written in centuries of conquest, empire, and rebellion, a crossroads of cultures and invaders. After World War II, under King Zahir Shah, the country experienced a period of cautious stability. The king introduced moderate reforms, walking a delicate line between modernization and tradition. He suppressed radical voices on both ends of the political spectrum, Islamists demanding a strictly theocratic state, and communists yearning for a Soviet-style transformation. In 1964, he promulgated a more liberal constitution, one that permitted political parties and opened doors to urban intellectual engagement. Kabul's universities became crucibles of ideological ferment, where moderates debated with monarchists, Islamists argued with communists, and the seeds of revolution quietly germinated. Among the Afghan communists, the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan emerged, founded by figures such as Hafizullah Amin, Babrak Karmal, and Nur Muhammad Taraki. These men had close ties to the KGB and admired the Soviet model of governance in Central Asia. Publicly, they presented a moderate front to win urban elites' trust, but within their ranks, ambitions ran high. By 1967, ideological divisions had already split the PDPA into two factions: the hardline Khalq faction under Taraki and the more moderate Parcham faction led by Karmal. Parallel to these developments, Afghan Islamists debated the nature of a modern Islamic society. The Jamiat-e-Islami emerged as a key conservative group, drawing inspiration from Egypt's Muslim Brotherhood. King Zahir Shah, wary of the growing Marxist influence, encouraged Islamist activity as a counterweight, inadvertently strengthening opposition networks that would later challenge any regime in Kabul. The geopolitical environment further complicated Afghanistan's position. The country, officially non-aligned, relied heavily on Soviet aid for infrastructure projects, while simultaneously receiving expertise and technical support from the United States, West Germany, and other Western nations. American scholar Louis Dupree described the extraordinary living conditions of foreign advisors. In towns outside Kabul, Soviet engineers and American technicians resided in luxury, complete with swimming pools, spacious apartments, and theaters. Their presence fueled the growth of a small urban middle class, while the countryside largely remained untouched by modernization, resistant to reforms such as women's education and equal rights. By the late 1960s, Afghanistan's modernization lagged behind other developing nations, and King Zahir remained hesitant to introduce further democratization, fearing the destabilizing effects of communism. In 1973, Muhammad Daoud Khan, cousin of the king, seized power in a military-backed coup. Initially cooperating with moderate communists, Daoud soon consolidated power, silencing opposition and purging the civil service and military officer corps. His policies angered Islamists, who fled to Pakistan, where they received training and support from the ISI under President Zulfikar Ali Bhutto. Former engineering student Mohammad Eshaq recalled fleeing into the mountains in 1975 after a failed operation in the Panjshir Valley, struggling with cold, hunger, and exhaustion while evading capture. Daoud's regime sought international support, requesting military and development aid from both the United States and the Soviet Union. Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev, in a meeting with Daoud in April of 1977, warned that NATO operatives in northern Afghanistan posed a security risk, a suggestion Daoud rejected, asserting the independence of his country. By April of 1978, political tension had escalated. Demonstrations at the funeral of a prominent Afghan communist led to the arrest of PDPA leaders. Yet, the party had grown stronger, uniting its factions and securing KGB support while infiltrating state institutions, including segments of the Afghan army. The stage was set for the Sour Revolution. Tanks rolled into Kabul as jet fighters screamed overhead. PDPA troops executed Daoud and over 1,000 of his loyalists in a rapid and bloody coup. 15-year-old Afghans witnessed the upheaval firsthand, hearing revolutionary broadcasts and seeing the immediate consequences of power seized through violence. Within hours, the new Democratic Republic of Afghanistan, under the leadership of Taraki and Amin, began implementing radical reforms, land redistribution, women's rights initiatives, and the suppression of opposition through mass arrests and executions. The PDPA publicly declared non-alignment in foreign policy, yet neighbors such as Pakistan and Iran, along with the United States, viewed the developments with suspicion. Soviet reactions were cautious. They provided advisors, military equipment, and financial aid, but debated the risks of full-scale intervention. Internal PDPA factionalism, a deeply religious population, and traditional social hierarchies complicated governance. The radical measures of Taraki and Amin, including the targeting of mullahs and tribal leaders, only fueled widespread resistance. Local uprisings empowered Mujahideen forces in northern and eastern provinces, while the PDPA's control weakened under the strain of internal purges and increasing insurgency. In February of 1979, the kidnapping and death of U.S. Ambassador Adolph Dubs in Kabul further strained international relations. A week-long uprising in Herat in March resulted in thousands of deaths and drew global attention to the volatility of the Afghan state. Taraki, seeking support, requested Soviet intervention, which the Politburo debated extensively. Yuri Andropov, head of the KGB, argued against full intervention, warning of the impossibility of achieving socialism in Afghanistan solely through force. By September of 1979, Amin had orchestrated the murder of Taraki and assumed full control, seeking alliances with the United States and the United Kingdom. The Soviets, fearing Amin's unreliability and potential Western ties, secretly planned regime change. On December 12th, the Politburo decided to replace Amin with Babrak Karmal and deploy a limited military force to support the new government. Operation Baikal 7-9 was meticulously planned. Soviet airborne divisions, motor rifle divisions, and special forces units coordinated a complex assault to secure Kabul, Bagram airfield, and strategic points along the ring road connecting major cities. The goal: present the operation as friendly assistance while simultaneously eliminating Amin and consolidating Soviet influence. On December 25th, Soviet troops began crossing into Afghanistan from the northwest and northeast, advancing along key highways and mountain passes. Special forces prepared to neutralize Amin at Taj Beg Palace, an operation complicated by heavy fortifications and loyal Afghan defenders. The assault force was divided into 12 groups, each with specific objectives: neutralize tanks, storm the palace, secure surrounding positions, and provide fire support with advanced weaponry. Operation Storm 333 commenced on December 27th. Amin, unaware of the full scale of the assault, believed the Soviets were allies. The initial attempts to poison him with cola failed. Urban sabotage, communications disruption, and precise assaults on government and infrastructure buildings unfolded simultaneously. Soviet forces stormed Taj Beg Palace, engaging in fierce close-quarters combat, ultimately killing Amin and consolidating Karmal's position. The operation lasted 43 minutes, leaving hundreds dead and dozens wounded on both sides. The following day, December 28th, Babrak Karmal arrived in Kabul, promising unity and reforms. Yet skepticism persisted among Afghans. Tens of thousands fled to Pakistan by January of 1980. The Soviet Union had executed a rapid regime change, but the consequences of the invasion and occupation would extend far beyond the immediate military success. Operation Baikal 79 had been a calculated gamble, reflecting Cold War fears, regional dynamics, and ideological imperatives. By the end of 1979, Afghanistan was under Soviet influence, yet resistance was mounting. The PDPA was fractured, and the stage was set for a protracted conflict whose human and geopolitical costs would reverberate for decades. The initial triumph of the Soviet invasion masked the complexity and depth of the challenges ahead, both within Afghanistan and in the international arena. The winter of 1979 descended upon Kabul with a bitter intensity. Snow blanketed the streets, draping the mud brick houses, and the ring road connecting the capital to Mazar-e-Sharif and Kandahar in an icy white sheet. The mountains surrounding the city were capped with snow, their jagged peaks cutting through the gray sky. The Afghan people, already shaken by the dramatic events of late December, faced a harsh season that amplified their uncertainty. Markets were sparse, with produce scarce, and the constant presence of Soviet troops patrolling the streets lent an unnatural rhythm to daily life. Babrak Karmal, newly installed as head of the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan, took his first steps as leader with cautious determination. He appeared publicly at government buildings and on the radio, promising unity, stability, and the cessation of the brutal purges carried out under Amin's rule. Yet, in private meetings with Soviet advisors, it was clear that the real challenges had just begun. The PDPA was fractured, with lingering tensions between the Khalq and Parkam factions. Taraki loyalists remained scattered in Kabul and in northern provinces, and suspicion ran deep among the party's ranks. Soviet officers stationed in Kabul advised caution. General Dmitry Ustinov, in regular communications with Moscow, emphasized that Afghan forces were demoralized and unreliable, warning that relying solely on local troops to maintain order would be disastrous. Soviet planners recommended embedding advisors directly within Afghan army units, while preparing mobile brigades to respond quickly to insurgent uprisings. The Afghan countryside, meanwhile, simmered with rebellion. Mujahideen fighters, organized along tribal lines and motivated by religious conviction, began mobilizing in the north, east, and southern provinces. The rugged terrain provided ideal conditions for guerrilla warfare. Snow and mountain passes limited Soviet mobility, forcing reliance on helicopters and airdrops for supply lines. Villages in Badakhshan, Paktia, and Nangarhar became staging grounds for insurgent activities, as local populations, distrustful of the communist government, provided shelter and intelligence to the rebels. By early January of 1980, Karmal authorized a series of operations intended to pacify key provinces, Soviet advisors coordinated with Afghan army units, deploying motor rifle divisions to secure roadways and transport routes. Air support included Mi-24 Hind helicopters, capable of swift strikes and psychological intimidation. Yet, despite technological superiority, the Soviet-Afghan forces struggled against small, mobile insurgent groups. Mines and improvised explosive devices were increasingly used to slow convoys and isolate outposts. Winter storms further complicated operations. Snowdrifts blocked key passes, freezing rivers prevented rapid movement, and communication lines were constantly disrupted. Soviet engineers worked tirelessly to clear roads and maintain supply chains, often under fire from hidden snipers. Afghan soldiers, unaccustomed to coordinated military campaigns in the mountains, frequently suffered frostbite and desertion. The combination of environmental hardship and insurgent harassment ensured that even small skirmishes became costly and dangerous. In Kabul, life continued under tight military oversight. Streets were patrolled by Soviet armored vehicles and Afghan troops loyal to Karmal. Curfews were imposed, and public gatherings were limited to controlled party events. Propaganda campaigns highlighted the supposed benefits of the PDPA regime: literacy programs, modernization projects, and women's rights initiatives. Yet skepticism ran deep among the populace. Many Afghans perceived Soviet presence as occupation rather than assistance. A teacher in Kabul recalled in February of 1980, "We were told the Soviets are our friends, but their soldiers walk the streets like masters, and people whisper in fear when we mention their presence." Meanwhile, insurgents leveraged the harsh winter to their advantage. Small bands of fighters, adept at navigating the mountains, struck isolated checkpoints and supply convoys. In January and February, multiple attacks disrupted food and ammunition deliveries to key garrisons. Reports from Bagram airfield indicated that Mujahideen activity had increased, with sabotage operations targeting power lines, bridges, and communication towers. Soviet helicopter units were dispatched to retaliate, but often found themselves lured into ambushes in narrow valleys. Amid this turbulence, Karmal worked to consolidate political power within the PDPA. Purges of remaining Amin loyalists continued, though less violently than in the previous December. Party meetings emphasized loyalty to Moscow, framing the Soviet Union as both protector and partner. Karmal recognized that without Soviet support, his government could not survive. Yet he also sought to assert some independence, negotiating with local tribal leaders and provincial governors to maintain a fragile balance. In March of 1980, spring approached, melting snow and opening the roads to broader military campaigns. The Red Army intensified field operations, deploying units to secure strategic locations and suppress insurgent strongholds. Helicopters and armored vehicles provided rapid mobility, but the insurgents' intimate knowledge of the terrain continued to frustrate Soviet and Afghan forces. Civilians were caught in the middle, often compelled to support one side or the other to survive. Stories emerged from villages in Paktia province, where families hid Mujahideen fighters, while Afghan government troops conducted sweeps, bombed out homes, scorched fields, and abandoned livestock testified to the escalating violence. Despite the hardships, Karmal maintained an image of order in Kabul. Cultural events, rallies, and radio broadcasts projected a sense of normalcy and control. Yet the news from the provinces told a different story. Intelligence reports indicated that insurgent numbers were increasing. Recruitment was robust among displaced families, and morale among Afghan government troops was declining. Soviet advisors stressed the need for stronger coordination, proposing combined arms operations with better integration between infantry, artillery, and helicopter units. By the end of March, the winter had fully receded, leaving muddy roads and swollen rivers. The first months of Karmal's rule had been marked by limited successes in the urban centers, but growing instability across the countryside. The conflict was no longer confined to small skirmishes. It had begun to take the shape of a protracted insurgency. The spring of 1980 brought a delicate, uneasy hope. Urban life in Kabul showed signs of revival. Markets reopened, schools resumed, classes and street vendors returned. But beneath this surface, the country was increasingly fragmented. Karmal's government, reliant on Soviet aid and military power, remained isolated from the rural population, while insurgents strengthened their networks, awaiting the opportunity to strike. The stage was set for a long and bloody confrontation, one that would test the endurance of both Afghan and Soviet forces and set the tone for the devastating decade ahead. The heat of summer in Afghanistan arrived early in 1980. By June, the valleys and plains were scorched under a relentless sun, while the mountains radiated warmth that made long marches exhausting for both soldiers and civilians. Dust choked the air along the ring roads, and the scent of baked earth mingled with smoke from recent skirmishes. Kabul, the capital, felt relatively calm, yet every patrol, checkpoint, and convoy reminded the residents that war was never far away. Babrak Karmal, now 6 months into his leadership of the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan, faced mounting challenges. Though he had survived the violent upheavals of December 1979, the countryside was erupting into widespread insurgency. Reports from the north and east described attacks on supply convoys, destruction of bridges, and ambushes on government forces. The Mujahideen, organized loosely along tribal lines but increasingly coordinated by veteran fighters trained in Pakistan, demonstrated remarkable agility and determination. Soviet advisors, embedded within Afghan army units, urged swift action. General Boris Ivanov, stationed at Bagram Airfield, emphasized that controlling the terrain was critical. Motor rifle divisions were deployed along strategic routes, connecting major urban centers, with helicopter gunships providing air support and rapid reaction capability. Yet the Afghan soldiers, demoralized and often distrustful of the PDPA leadership, struggled to maintain cohesion under fire. Desertion rates rose, and small pockets of resistance continued to flourish in remote areas. In the eastern provinces, particularly Nangarhar and Kunar, Mujahideen fighters used the rugged mountains to their advantage. They launched nighttime raids on isolated garrisons, sabotaged supply depots, and melted back into the shadows before Afghan or Soviet reinforcements could respond. Local villagers often aided the insurgents, motivated by a mix of religious conviction, opposition to communist policies, and fear of government reprisal. Afghan government reports described entire districts beyond control, while Soviet officers acknowledged that conventional tactics were of limited use in such terrain. Karmal sought to maintain the appearance of governance and stability. Public speeches emphasized modernization projects. New schools, clinics, and irrigation systems were touted as signs of progress. Radio broadcasts highlighted the victories of Afghan and Soviet forces in skirmishes. Yet these messages often rang hollow in villages where the Mujahideen controlled daily life. The gap between urban perception and rural reality widened, creating an increasingly precarious situation for the government. By July of 1980, the Red Army had intensified operations across multiple fronts. A combined force of Afghan and Soviet troops launched coordinated sweeps in the Panjshir Valley, attempting to root out insurgent strongholds. Mi-24 Hind helicopters patrolled the skies relentlessly, providing close air support and psychological intimidation. However, the Mujahideen proved elusive, often striking convoys with ambushes or mines and vanishing into the rugged landscape. The forests and ravines became natural fortresses for the insurgents. Civilian casualties mounted. Families fled villages, abandoning homes, livestock, and fields to escape the crossfire. Refugee streams began flowing toward Pakistan, particularly through Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and Baluchistan provinces. Humanitarian concerns, combined with the harsh summer sun, created a crisis of displacement. Afghan government officials, reliant on Soviet logistical support, struggled to provide basic necessities for both soldiers and civilians. In Kabul, life continued under a tense, watchful order. Soviet troops patrolled the streets, while the PDPA maintained strict curfews and controlled public gatherings. The city itself became a hub for intelligence and military planning. Karmal held daily meetings with advisors, analyzing insurgent movements and planning operations to secure key routes and communication lines. Yet reports frequently arrived late, and often they were contradictory. The Red Army's technological superiority did not always translate into tactical success, especially in provinces where terrain favored the defenders. Summer storms in the highlands added further complications. Flash floods destroyed temporary bridges, washed away roads, and cut off isolated garrisons from resupply. Engineers worked tirelessly to maintain infrastructure, often under fire from hidden Mujahideen units. Afghan soldiers, many poorly equipped and lacking combat experience, faced extreme fatigue and morale issues. Despite repeated Soviet-led campaigns, the insurgents remained resilient, blending seamlessly with local populations. Across the border in Pakistan, Mujahideen leadership coordinated recruitment, training, and arms supplies. Camps in the tribal areas became centers of preparation, with thousands of fighters learning guerrilla tactics and small unit coordination. Weapons supplied by the CIA and Saudi intelligence flowed into these camps, often funneled through the ISI. Afghan fighters returning from operations brought knowledge and experience that strengthened the overall insurgency. By the end of July, intelligence reports indicated that the Mujahideen could mobilize upwards of 40,000 fighters across multiple provinces, a significant force considering the size of the Afghan army. Karmal recognized that political legitimacy was as important as military strength. Efforts to co-opt tribal elders and religious leaders intensified. Offers of positions in local governance, economic incentives, and public acknowledgement were used to secure loyalty, though success was limited. Many tribal leaders viewed the PDPA and its Soviet backers as foreign occupiers, and cooperation was often temporary and reluctant. By August of 1980, the pattern of conflict was established. Government forces controlled urban centers and key transport routes, while the Mujahideen dominated rural areas, mountains, and isolated valleys. The Red Army's presence, while formidable, was stretched thin. Casualty reports mounted, and the difficulty of sustaining a long-term campaign in Afghanistan became increasingly evident to Soviet planners. Karmal's regime, dependent on external support and limited in its domestic influence, faced a critical test: consolidate authority in urban areas while attempting to erode the insurgency's hold on the countryside. Despite the challenges, both sides hardened their resolve. The Mujahideen celebrated small victories in the field, using them to rally, support, and inspire recruitment. Afghan and Soviet forces refined combined operations, testing air-ground coordination and rapid deployment tactics. The summer of 1980 demonstrated that Afghanistan was entering a protracted conflict, one that would stretch resources, test loyalties, and shape the trajectory of the war for years to come. The lessons of this summer would be repeated across the decades of war. Conventional military might alone could not dominate a determined insurgency in such a complex terrain, and the human, political, and cultural factors remained as critical as tanks and helicopters. By September of 1980, the Afghan landscape had shifted from the scorching summer heat to the cool, crisp air of autumn. The mountain slopes that had baked under the sun were now dotted with golden foliage, and the first hints of snow appeared at higher elevations. Rivers swelled with melting glaciers, and dust settled into the valleys, replaced by the earthy smell of damp soil. Despite the seasonal change, the war showed no signs of slowing. The Red Army's presence in Afghanistan was more pronounced than ever, yet the insurgency had grown in both size and coordination, taking full advantage of rugged terrain and local knowledge. In Kabul, Babrak Karmal's administration faced mounting pressures. Internal divisions within the PDPA, simmering since the Sour Revolution of 1978, had intensified. Moderate factions, frustrated by the violent purges of Taraki and Amin, sought to restrain the radical policies that had alienated large segments of the population. They advocated a more cautious approach to governance, arguing that brutal repression only fueled the insurgency. Karmal, however, reliant on Soviet backing, often found his authority undermined by competing party interests. Meetings in the presidential palace were tense, with advisors openly criticizing each other, while intelligence reports of insurgent movements arrived daily. Outside the capital, the situation was grim. In the eastern provinces, such as Kunar and Nangarhar, the Mujahideen continued to strike swiftly and unpredictably. Afghan army units, often demoralized and poorly supplied, struggled to defend villages and maintain checkpoints. Soviet advisors coordinated counterinsurgency operations, using Mi-24 Hind helicopters and artillery to strike rebel positions. Yet these efforts frequently failed to yield lasting results, as the Mujahideen melted back into the mountains, taking advantage of every ravine, cave, and forest. In the northern provinces, including Kunduz and Baghlan, similar patterns emerged. Entire districts slipped from government control, with Mujahideen forces establishing bases in valleys inaccessible to conventional units. Reports indicated that some local militias, initially neutral or even supportive of the government, had joined the insurgents, motivated by grievances over land reform policies, executions, and forced conscription. The insurgency had become not only a military threat, but also a social phenomenon, drawing on decades of distrust towards centralized authority. The civilian population bore the brunt of the conflict. Refugees streamed across borders into Pakistan, swelling camps in Peshawar and Quetta. Families carried what little they could salvage, while the elderly and sick struggled to survive the arduous journey. Many villages were abandoned, leaving crops to rot and livestock to wander unattended. Those who remained faced indiscriminate violence, artillery strikes, aerial bombardments, and retaliatory raids by government forces. Hospitals were overwhelmed, and aid agencies struggled to provide basic necessities amid ongoing hostilities. Soviet military planners, observing the autumn campaign from their forward command posts, recognized the limits of their operational approach. While armored columns and air support provided local superiority, insurgent tactics rendered many conventional maneuvers ineffective. Afghan army units, often untrained and poorly motivated, required constant guidance from Soviet officers. Desertions increased, and the effectiveness of the Afghan forces remained uneven. Meanwhile, Mujahideen units, highly mobile and familiar with the terrain, continued to exploit weaknesses in supply lines and isolated garrisons. In Kabul, political maneuvering became increasingly important. Karmal sought to consolidate power by co-opting tribal leaders and clerics, offering positions in local governance and economic incentives. Yet trust was hard to earn. Many community leaders remained skeptical of the PDPA and its Soviet patrons, fearing that cooperation might invite insurgent reprisals. Government attempts to implement modernization programs, schools, clinics, and irrigation projects were often thwarted by insecurity or sabotage. The message that the government was capable of protecting its citizens was difficult to convey when villages in multiple provinces were under rebel control. By October of 1980, intelligence reports suggested a significant expansion of Mujahideen activity. In Herat province, insurgents ambushed convoys and captured small towns, demonstrating coordination between previously isolated groups. In the eastern provinces, cross-border operations from Pakistan increased, bringing in weapons, training, and reinforcements. Afghan and Soviet forces responded with raids, aerial bombardments, and deployment of additional troops. Yet the insurgents adapted quickly, avoiding direct confrontation with superior forces. The autumn campaign also revealed deeper fractures within the PDPA. Moderate officials, alarmed by the human cost and the insurgency's resilience, advocated a more political approach, emphasizing negotiation, outreach, and reduced repression. Radicals, however, insisted on continued purges and aggressive operations, arguing that any leniency would embolden the Mujahideen and undermine the revolution. Karmal, caught between these factions, often deferred decisions to Soviet advisors, whose influence grew as the conflict intensified. Civilian narratives from this period provide a stark picture of life amid the fighting. A family in Kunar province recalled, "We hid in the mountains for weeks. The soldiers would come and go, and the rebels would pass like ghosts. We could not plant crops, we could not go to the village. Our food ran out, and the children cried from hunger. The air smelled of smoke and fear." Reports from other regions echoed similar experiences, with thousands displaced, injured, or killed. Soviet leadership in Moscow monitored the situation with growing concern. Politburo discussions emphasized the strategic importance of maintaining Afghanistan within the Soviet sphere of influence. Yet advisors like Yuri Andropov cautioned that the country's rugged terrain, coupled with the population's hostility and the insurgents' adaptability, made prolonged military success uncertain. Plans for winter offensives were drawn up, including increased troop deployments, fortified supply lines, and intensified aerial operations. Yet no solution promised a quick or decisive victory. The autumn of 1980 solidified the pattern of the Afghan conflict. Urban areas and key supply routes controlled by government forces, while rural regions and mountain strongholds dominated by insurgents. The Red Army's technological and numerical superiority could not fully compensate for local knowledge, mobility, and the deep-rooted grievances fueling resistance. Karmal's regime, heavily dependent on Soviet support, remained precarious, its authority contested by both insurgents and internal party factions. As winter approached, the people of Afghanistan faced the dual threat of harsh weather and relentless warfare. The lessons of the autumn campaign were clear. Conventional force alone could not pacify the country. Political cohesion was fragile, and insurgent resilience was formidable. The conflict had entered a new, grueling phase, setting the stage for what would become a protracted and devastating war. By December of 1980, Afghanistan had been transformed by the first snows of winter. The rugged peaks of the Hindu Kush were blanketed in ice and snow, rivers slowed by freezing temperatures, and the valleys shrouded in a damp, bitter chill. Roads that had been precarious during autumn became treacherous, with mud and frost turning supply lines into logistical nightmares. Yet, despite the harsh conditions, Soviet forces pressed on, determined to maintain momentum against a resilient and deeply entrenched insurgency. Soviet military planners anticipated challenges from the onset. Supply convoys had to traverse narrow mountain passes, where snowfall and icy roads slowed trucks and tanks to a crawl. Motorized infantry and armored columns faced constant threats from ambushes, particularly in narrow gorges where Mujahideen fighters could rain down fire from concealed positions. Helicopters were critical for reconnaissance, troop transport, and supply drops. But the winter winds and low visibility frequently grounded flights, stranding units and delaying reinforcements. In Kabul, Babrak Karmal's government sought to project an image of stability, but winter compounded the hardships faced by the population. Food and fuel shortages became widespread as supply lines struggled to reach isolated villages. Heating supplies ran low, and citizens endured bitter cold, often resorting to burning furniture or animal dung to keep warm. Hospitals were overwhelmed, particularly in northern and eastern provinces, as winter illnesses compounded injuries from ongoing fighting. Relief efforts were partially coordinated by Soviet advisors who deployed medical units and rations. But the scale of the crisis exceeded available resources. Military operations during winter focused on consolidating control over urban centers and key transit routes. Soviet troops launched winter offensives aimed at suppressing Mujahideen strongholds in valleys like Panjshir, Kunar, and Nuristan. Combat units employed heavy artillery, mechanized infantry, and air support to strike insurgent positions, often targeting cave networks and hillside fortifications. Yet, the insurgents proved highly adaptable, employing hit-and-run tactics, ambushes, and booby traps to harass and slow the Red Army. Many Afghan soldiers, poorly equipped for winter combat, suffered frostbite and fatigue, further undermining operational effectiveness. The winter campaign revealed stark contrasts between the Soviet perception of progress and the realities on the ground. While Soviet command emphasized territorial control and the suppression of insurgent concentrations, local populations remained hostile or indifferent. Civilians frequently fled villages ahead of offensives, leaving crops untended and livestock vulnerable. Soviet military reports noted that in many areas, soldiers encountered empty homes and burned villages, evidence of scorched earth tactics employed by insurgents to deny resources to advancing forces. Political instability within the PDPA persisted. Factionalism between hardline radicals and moderates intensified under the stress of winter operations. Radicals, often aligned with Soviet strategic objectives, advocated for uncompromising offensives and mass arrests of suspected insurgent collaborators. Moderates warned that continued violence risked alienating the populace and undermining any prospects for long-term stability. Karmal, balancing internal pressures and Soviet expectations, frequently deferred critical decisions to Moscow, resulting in delays and confusion at both strategic and tactical levels. Winter also exacerbated the humanitarian crisis. Refugees continued to pour into Pakistan, often traveling on foot through snow-covered mountains. Thousands suffered frostbite, exposure, and starvation. Refugee camps swelled beyond capacity, with inadequate food, shelter, and medical care. International aid organizations struggled to reach affected populations, hindered by both security concerns and harsh weather conditions. Personal accounts from this period paint a vivid picture of suffering. We walked for days through the snow, carrying children and blankets. Every night, we huddled together for warmth. Many of us became sick, and we lost neighbors to the cold. There was no way to cook food, no way to get medicine, Only God knew if we would survive. In urban centers, the winter brought additional challenges. Electricity shortages and damaged infrastructure left hospitals and schools struggling to operate. Snow blocked roads, making even short journeys hazardous. Afghan citizens faced both the physical dangers of winter and the constant threat of violence. Reports from Kabul indicated that Soviet forces and Afghan army units carried out house-to-house searches for insurgents and weapons, heightening tensions with civilians who were often caught in the crossfire. The winter of 1980 also revealed logistical weaknesses within the Soviet military. Fuel shortages, delayed armored columns, and supply convoys frequently encountered ambushes. Helicopter maintenance became a critical concern as freezing temperatures affected engines and rotor blades. Despite superior numbers and firepower, Soviet forces faced a relentless struggle to maintain operational readiness under extreme environmental conditions. Lessons from previous winter campaigns, including experiences in Siberia and Eastern Europe, were applied, but Afghanistan's rugged terrain and insurgent tactics posed unique challenges. Intelligence operations intensified during the winter months. Reconnaissance units and KGB agents monitored insurgent movements, while aerial surveillance sought to identify supply routes and hideouts. Despite these efforts, insurgents frequently altered their positions, utilizing caves, hidden paths, and tunnels to evade detection. Soviet officers noted that the insurgents' ability to blend into the population and utilize local knowledge made conventional counterinsurgency measures difficult to implement. Political and military developments in surrounding countries also influenced the conflict. Pakistan, maintaining support for the Mujahideen, continued to provide training, weapons, and logistical aid. Relations between the United States and Pakistan grew closer, with increased funding and intelligence sharing aimed at countering Soviet influence. Iran, following the revolution of 1979, remained a potential source of destabilization along Afghanistan's western border. The complex web of regional politics added further complications to Soviet and Afghan government efforts to stabilize the country. By February of 1981, the cumulative effects of winter, insurgent activity, and political tension were evident. The Red Army had secured key cities and major roads, but insurgent-controlled areas continued to thrive. Afghan army morale remained fragile, with desertions and disciplinary issues increasing. Civilian suffering intensified, with thousands of families displaced, enduring hunger, illness, and exposure to extreme cold. The PDPA's legitimacy remained contested, both internally and among the population, highlighting the fragile foundation upon which Soviet intervention rested. The winter of 1980 demonstrated that conventional military superiority alone could not achieve decisive results in Afghanistan. The combination of harsh environmental conditions, resilient insurgent tactics, and political complexity posed persistent challenges. Soviet forces, though technologically advanced and numerically superior, faced significant obstacles in implementing a comprehensive counterinsurgency strategy. Meanwhile, the Afghan population continued to endure immense hardship, caught between insurgent activity and the ongoing presence of foreign troops. As spring approached, Soviet planners began preparing for the seasonal thaw, anticipating both intensified insurgent operations and opportunities to expand control in previously contested areas. Winter had tested both the resilience of Soviet forces and the endurance of the Afghan people, underscoring the difficulty of establishing stability in a country with deep historical, social, and geographic challenges. The events of winter 1980 would shape the strategies, alliances, and policies for the next phase of the conflict, laying the groundwork for a prolonged and grueling struggle that would define Afghanistan for years to come. As the harsh winter of 1980 receded, Afghanistan's rugged landscapes emerged from beneath layers of snow, revealing valleys and plains scarred by conflict. The thawing rivers swelled with runoff, and muddy roads challenged movement for both civilians and military units. Yet for the Soviet forces and the Afghan government, spring represented a new operational season, a chance to consolidate control, reassert authority, and attempt to suppress a growing insurgency that had survived the winter largely intact. The Red Army mobilized early in March of 1981. Soviet planners emphasized the need to exploit the seasonal thaw, expanding patrols in northern provinces and reinforcing positions in key urban centers. Mechanized columns moved along the ring road connecting Mazar, Sharif, Kunduz, and Kabul, while air assaults targeted suspected Mujahideen strongholds in valleys previously inaccessible during winter. The Soviets were acutely aware, however, that insurgents had adapted their tactics. Ambushes were more sophisticated, escape routes better concealed, and local populations increasingly wary of outsiders. In rural areas, Mujahideen fighters re-emerged from caves and mountain hideouts with renewed vigor. Their operations became more daring as the snow melted, with small units striking convoys, ambushing Afghan army patrols, and sabotaging infrastructure. The insurgents had perfected the use of explosives, mines, and hit-and-run attacks, exploiting their knowledge of terrain to neutralize Soviet technological advantages. Local villagers often assisted the insurgents, whether through ideological support, coercion, or the promise of protection, further complicating Soviet efforts to maintain control. Political developments during the spring of 1981 added to the complexity. Babrak Karmal's government continued to face internal factionalism within the PDPA. Hardline radicals, aligned with Soviet expectations, urged uncompromising offensives, while moderates cautioned against alienating the population through excessive force. Karmal, under pressure from Moscow, often deferred to Soviet advisors, whose presence was both a reassurance and a source of tension. The spring thaw also highlighted the limitations of the Afghan army. Many units remained poorly trained, poorly motivated, and prone to desertion. Soviet advisors intensified training programs emphasizing counterinsurgency tactics and mountain warfare. But the scale of the problem was immense. Morale remained fragile, and even urban garrisons reported frequent disciplinary issues. By mid-April, reports indicated that as many as 45% of Afghan army units had experienced desertions or refusals to participate in combat operations. Civilian life was marked by uncertainty and fear. The spring rains brought fertile soil and the promise of harvest, but agricultural activities were frequently disrupted by fighting. Villagers often abandoned fields to avoid conflict, leading to food shortages and further economic strain. Refugee flows continued into Pakistan, and temporary settlements were overcrowded, unsanitary, and undersupplied. Stories from this period paint a vivid picture of human resilience amid adversity. We returned to our village in early April, hoping to plant wheat, but found the fields destroyed and our home burned. We had no choice but to sleep under trees, hiding during the day from soldiers and fighters alike. The children were hungry, and the winter sickness had left many weak. Yet we had to survive. Urban centers like Kabul saw an uneasy calm. Soviet and Afghan army patrols maintained a visible presence, checkpoints were reinforced, and curfews were strictly enforced. However, insurgent influence remained, as propaganda, secret networks, and sympathizers undermined authority. Karmal's administration sought to portray progress, reopening schools, repairing infrastructure, and promoting the PDPA's social reforms. Yet public trust was minimal, and fear of reprisals created a tense atmosphere. Internationally, Afghanistan's situation remained a focal point of Cold War tension. The United States increased support for the Mujahideen through Pakistan, providing training, equipment, and financial aid. China and Saudi Arabia also contributed, aiming to counter Soviet influence in the region. Diplomatic efforts by the United Nations were largely ineffective, as the Soviet Union refused to engage in negotiations that could compromise its strategic objectives. By spring 1981, Afghanistan had become a proxy battleground in the larger East-West confrontation. Soviet military strategy during this period combined conventional offensives with specialized operations. Airstrikes targeted insurgent supply caches, while elite Spetsnaz units conducted raids against high-value targets. Despite technological superiority, these operations were costly and often provoked civilian casualties, further alienating the population. Helicopter mobility remained crucial, particularly for reaching isolated mountain valleys and providing support to outlying garrisons. Yet adverse weather and terrain continued to strain logistical capabilities, highlighting the ongoing challenges of sustaining a prolonged campaign in Afghanistan. Mujahideen tactics evolved with the season. Groups utilized the thawing terrain to establish concealed supply lines, transport weapons, and prepare for coordinated attacks. Mountain passes, previously impassable in winter, were now used for rapid infiltration and retreat. Insurgents relied on intelligence gathered from sympathetic villagers and local informants, allowing them to strike with precision and vanish before Soviet or Afghan forces could respond. The spring of 1981 marked an escalation in guerrilla operations, demonstrating the resilience and adaptability of Afghan resistance. Throughout March and April, sporadic but intense battles occurred across provinces such as Kunar, Nuristan, and Helmand. Soviet forces employed heavy artillery barrages, airstrikes, and mechanized assaults, but insurgent groups avoided direct confrontations whenever possible, focusing on ambushes and hit-and-run tactics. The high cost of operations became evident in both manpower and morale. Reports from frontline commanders noted that while enemy combatants were often neutralized, the broader objective of pacifying rural areas remained elusive. Humanitarian efforts struggled to keep pace with the ongoing conflict. Soviet and Afghan aid teams delivered food, medicine, and clothing to affected communities, but access was limited. Winter destruction combined with spring floods left many villages isolated, and the threat of ambush made aid delivery perilous. Civilian suffering continued, with thousands of families facing displacement, hunger, and disease. International observers expressed concern over the humanitarian impact, though access and verification were limited due to security restrictions. Political maneuvering continued behind the scenes. Karmel sought to strengthen alliances with tribal leaders, local officials, and moderate insurgents willing to defect, aiming to stabilize contested regions. Soviet advisors provided guidance, though disagreements persisted over the balance between military force and political outreach. The leadership recognized that military dominance alone could not secure lasting control. Winning the support of the population, or at least neutralizing their opposition, was essential. By May of 1981, the seasonal shift had reinforced the realities of Afghanistan's conflict. Soviet forces, despite superior equipment, were engaged in a prolonged struggle with an adaptive and determined insurgency. Afghan government authority remained fragile, particularly in rural areas. Civilians endured ongoing hardship, navigating a landscape scarred by winter's toll and the resurgence of guerrilla warfare. The spring of 1981 would set the stage for further escalation, with both Soviet forces and the Mujahideen preparing for intensified campaigns in the months to come. The spring campaign underscored a critical lesson. Afghanistan's terrain, culture, and history of resistance made conventional military success difficult to achieve. Despite temporary gains in urban centers and along major transportation routes, insurgent control persisted, and the human cost of the conflict continued to rise. Soviet leaders, Karmel's administration, and the international community all recognized that the struggle in Afghanistan would be protracted, costly, and far from decisive. The summer of 1981 dawned over Afghanistan with a heat that bore down relentlessly on the rugged mountains, dusty valleys, and sprawling plains. Temperatures in lowland provinces like Helmand, Kandahar, and Nangarhar regularly soared above 40 degrees Celsius, while higher altitudes in the Hindu Kush offered little relief from the sun's glare. The parched terrain intensified the challenges of warfare, limiting mobility for mechanized Soviet units and Afghan government convoys, while simultaneously complicating logistics for both armies and insurgents alike. By June, Soviet forces had intensified their operations across key northern and eastern provinces. The Red Army's strategy combined large-scale offensives along the Ring Road with targeted raids deep into insurgent-controlled territories. Mechanized brigades, reinforced with T-62 tanks and BMP infantry carriers, pushed into rural valleys where Mujahideen fighters had established fortified positions. The Soviets relied heavily on air mobility. Mi-24 Hind attack helicopters patrolled river valleys, targeting suspected supply caches, while Mi-8 transports inserted troops behind insurgent lines. Despite Soviet firepower, the Mujahideen demonstrated remarkable adaptability. Using the rugged terrain to their advantage, insurgent units dispersed during conventional assaults, reappearing in strategically significant locations to ambush convoys or stage hit-and-run attacks. Mountainous areas and forested valleys proved especially challenging for Soviet forces. Entrenched fighters could remain hidden for days, using caves, abandoned villages, and natural cover to avoid detection. By the end of June, Soviet intelligence estimated that Mujahideen forces controlled or influenced nearly 50% of rural Afghanistan, with pockets of concentrated resistance in Kunar, Nuristan, and Paktia provinces. The human cost of this escalation was devastating. Civilians, already suffering from displacement during winter and spring, faced additional hardship. Summer drought compounded food shortages, while the relentless heat made travel across mountainous terrain dangerous. Families who remained in conflict zones struggled to cultivate fields, tend livestock, or secure clean water. Refugee flows to Pakistan accelerated, with aid organizations struggling to provide adequate relief. Reports from northern provinces described entire villages abandoned, their homes burned or destroyed during offensives. Children suffered the most, facing malnutrition, disease, and exposure to violence. Urban centers were tense, but comparatively more stable. Kabul, Mazar I, Sharif, and Kandahar maintained a strong military presence, but the city streets were filled with tension. Checkpoints and patrols were omnipresent, and curfews enforced to prevent insurgent infiltration. Propaganda from both the PDPA and Mujahideen shaped public perception. Government broadcasts emphasized stability and socialist progress, while Mujahideen messages highlighted Soviet oppression and the defense of Islamic values. Public trust remained minimal, with most residents attempting to avoid involvement in the conflict. Internally, Babrak Karmal's government faced ongoing challenges. The PDPA remained factionalized, with hardliners advocating uncompromising military measures and moderates pushing for political outreach to tribal leaders and local communities. Karmal's reliance on Soviet advisors created both dependence and tension. While Moscow provided strategic guidance, advisors often overstepped, influencing operations and occasionally clashing with Afghan commanders. These internal disputes hampered decision-making and often slowed operational responses to insurgent movements. Soviet military doctrine emphasized control of transportation routes, population centers, and supply lines. Convoys, transporting food, fuel, and ammunition, became primary targets for insurgent attacks, particularly along the ring road. Mines, improvised explosive devices, and ambushes inflicted significant casualties on Afghan and Soviet forces. Soviet countermeasures included increased air reconnaissance, enhanced convoy security, and preemptive strikes against suspected Mujahideen bases. Despite these efforts, insurgent operations remained unpredictable. highlighting the limitations of conventional forces against a highly mobile guerrilla enemy. Air operations played a critical role during the summer months. Mi-24 Hind helicopters conducted continuous patrols, combining firepower with rapid troop deployment. MiG-21 fighters provided close air support during offensives, striking enemy positions and disrupting supply routes. Yet the insurgents' knowledge of terrain, coupled with their use of concealment and deception, mitigated the impact of these airstrikes. Villagers reported frequent overflights, sometimes warning insurgents of imminent attacks, allowing them to relocate or counterattack effectively. In addition to military operations, political maneuvers sought to stabilize the PDPA's control over Afghanistan. Karmal attempted to forge alliances with tribal leaders, promising local autonomy, development aid, and security in exchange for cooperation. These efforts met mixed success. Some tribes negotiated truces or defected, while others remained loyal to the insurgents, motivated by religious ideology or historical grievances. Soviet advisors cautioned against over-reliance on local alliances, emphasizing the need for strong military presence to enforce compliance. The insurgency's growth prompted changes in Mujahideen's strategy. Small, mobile units conducted simultaneous attacks on multiple targets, spreading government forces thin and creating a perception of omnipresent threat. In Helmand province, insurgents destroyed bridges and irrigation systems, disrupting supply lines and hampering agricultural production. In the northeast, Kunar and Nuristan witnessed fierce ambushes along river valleys, with dozens of Afghan army soldiers killed or captured in coordinated operations. These tactical successes bolstered the morale of insurgent fighters who drew strength from ideological conviction, local support, and knowledge of the terrain. Civilian narratives during this period provide a vivid window into the summer of 1981. We stayed in the mountains during June, hiding in caves and abandoned huts. The heat was unbearable, but we could not return to our village. It had been burned by soldiers. We scavenged for water and waited for the insurgents to bring food. Every day, the sound of helicopters and distant gunfire reminded us that survival depended on being invisible. By July, the intensity of operations reached a peak. Soviet forces launched coordinated offensives in eastern provinces, attempting to crush entrenched insurgent units. Mechanized columns advanced along key routes, supported by airstrikes and artillery bombardments. While these offensives inflicted casualties on the Mujahideen, they also provoked retaliation, as insurgent fighters struck government positions and ambushed convoys. Both sides experienced attrition, and civilian populations bore the heaviest toll, caught between military operations and insurgent reprisals. Humanitarian conditions remained critical. Displacement, food insecurity, and disease affected tens of thousands. Refugee camps in Pakistan swelled, straining limited resources. International aid organizations faced logistical challenges and security risks, navigating a landscape dominated by conflict and mistrust. Despite these hardships, local communities continued to display resilience, maintaining social structures, religious practices, and cultural traditions under extraordinarily difficult circumstances. Diplomatic developments in summer 1981 underscored Afghanistan's role in the broader Cold War. The United States continued to support the Mujahideen through Pakistan's inter-services intelligence, providing arms, training, and financial aid. Saudi Arabia and China contributed funds and equipment, seeking to counter Soviet influence. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, remained committed to supporting Karmal's government, deploying advisors, trainers, and specialized troops, and cautiously attempting to balance military operations with political outreach. By the end of August 1981, the situation remained volatile. The Soviet military controlled major urban centers and key transportation corridors, yet insurgent influence persisted in rural areas and mountain strongholds. Afghan government authority, reliant on Soviet support, faced ongoing challenges from factional disputes within the PDPA and continued guerrilla resistance. Civilians continued to suffer, and refugee flows showed no sign of abating. The summer of 1981 would ultimately reinforce the realization that Afghanistan's conflict could not be resolved solely through military means, setting the stage for further escalation in the coming autumn. The autumn of 1981 arrived over Afghanistan with a sharp transition from the relentless heat of summer to cooler, wind-swept days and increasingly frigid nights in the highlands. Across the Hindu Kush and Central Highlands, temperatures dropped to single digits Celsius after sunset, while lowland provinces such as Helmand, Kandahar, and Nangarhar enjoyed milder but still arid conditions. The seasonal change brought both tactical opportunities and challenges to Soviet and Afghan government forces, as well as to the Mujahideen insurgents. By early September, the Red Army shifted focus from expansive summer offensives to consolidating control over urban centers and critical supply lines. Soviet military strategy now emphasized securing major provincial capitals, including Kabul, Kandahar, Jalalabad, Mazar-i-Sharif, and Herat, while maintaining pressure on insurgent-controlled rural areas. Soviet mechanized brigades, supported by T-62 tanks and BMP infantry fighting vehicles, established fortified positions along key transportation arteries. Mi-24 Hind helicopters and MiG-21 fighters provided close air support, while Soviet reconnaissance units utilized newly installed radar systems and aerial photography to monitor insurgent movements. The Mujahideen, emboldened by their summer successes, intensified guerrilla tactics during the autumn months. Small, mobile units conducted ambushes along river valleys, destroyed bridges and irrigation infrastructure, and targeted Afghan government checkpoints. Knowledge of terrain remained a decisive advantage. Mountainous regions allowed insurgent fighters to disappear quickly after engagements, frustrating Soviet attempts to pursue them. By mid-September, intelligence reports estimated that insurgents controlled or influenced nearly 60% of rural Afghanistan, including strongholds in Kunar, Nuristan, Paktia, and parts of Helmand. Civilian populations bore the increasing brunt of this protracted conflict. Autumn winds carried dust and debris across fields and villages, compounding the scarcity of food and water. Displacement continued at alarming rates. Tens of thousands of families fled to Pakistan, Iran, or urban centers within Afghanistan. Refugee camps swelled, placing enormous strain on humanitarian resources. Disease, malnutrition, and psychological trauma were pervasive, and reports from provincial hospitals highlighted the urgent need for medical support. Children and the elderly were particularly vulnerable, with many succumbing to illness exacerbated by the harsh conditions. In urban areas, the PDPA and Soviet authorities focused on maintaining a semblance of order. Curfews, checkpoints, and patrols were strictly enforced in Kabul, Herat, and Kandahar. The government continued to propagate its message through radio broadcasts, emphasizing the legitimacy of Karmal's regime and the necessity of Soviet assistance. However, public trust remained limited. Citizens were acutely aware of the violence, executions, and forced relocations perpetrated during the previous months. Many families adopted a strategy of quiet survival, avoiding political involvement and keeping children away from schools or workplaces associated with the government. Internally, the PDPA grappled with factionalism and strategic disagreements. Hardliners pressed for aggressive military campaigns against insurgents, advocating for punitive operations in villages suspected of harboring fighters. Moderates urged political engagement with tribal leaders, local councils, and religious authorities to stabilize areas without large-scale bloodshed. Babrak Karmal, constrained by both internal party dynamics and reliance on Soviet advisors, struggled to balance these competing approaches. Soviet officials frequently intervened, providing strategic guidance while pressuring Karmal to demonstrate decisive control over insurgent areas. Military operations during the autumn emphasized both direct confrontation and psychological warfare. Convoys transporting supplies faced continual threats from ambushes and mines. Soviet forces deployed reconnaissance drones, reconnaissance teams, and informants to identify insurgent positions, while psychological operations units distributed leaflets urging surrender and compliance. Despite these efforts, insurgent groups adapted quickly, moving camps, using decoys, and capitalizing on the population's support or fear to maintain operational security. Air power continued to play a critical role in the autumn of 1981. Mi-24 Hind helicopters conducted rapid troop insertions and strikes against suspected Mujahideen bases, while MiG-21 fighters targeted supply caches and intercepted insurgent reinforcements. The effectiveness of these air operations, however, was mitigated by the insurgents' use of rugged terrain, caves, and concealed pathways. Villagers often warned fighters of impending strikes, allowing them to relocate or execute countermeasures. Helicopter pilots frequently reported sudden engagements from hidden positions, underscoring the constant risk of ambush even in areas presumed secure. The insurgency also evolved its tactical doctrine during this period. Units coordinated simultaneous attacks on multiple fronts, forcing Afghan and Soviet forces to spread thin. In eastern provinces, ambushes along river valleys and mountain passes disrupted supply lines, while insurgent saboteurs destroyed bridges, vehicles, and military infrastructure. In the north, Sporadic assaults on government outposts and checkpoints challenged the Red Army's attempts to control rural districts. These operations enhanced insurgent morale and demonstrated their resilience, providing a narrative of resistance against a foreign-backed government. Civilians provided first-hand accounts of the hardships endured during autumn 1981. "We left our village in late September because the soldiers came looking for insurgents. The cold nights were brutal. We huddled under blankets and prayed. There was little food and water was scarce. Our children grew weak, but we had no choice but to keep moving. The helicopters would fly overhead, and we knew the danger was always near." As autumn progressed, the PDPA and Soviet leadership also prepared for the coming winter. Supply lines were reinforced with winter provisions, including blankets, fuel, and food rations. Soviet engineers constructed defensive fortifications, dug trenches, and reinforced outposts to withstand colder conditions. Both sides understood that the harsh winter could alter the operational tempo, with heavy snowfall in the Hindu Kush potentially immobilizing vehicles, hindering resupply, and creating opportunities for ambushes in isolated valleys. Diplomatic and international dynamics remained tense. The United States continued to provide assistance to the Mujahideen through Pakistan's ISI, supplying weapons, funds, and training. Saudi Arabia, China, and other Muslim nations maintained support, seeking to counter Soviet influence. Within the Soviet Union, policymakers debated the efficacy of ongoing military operations. Some officials emphasized the need for a longer-term political solution, while military planners pushed for sustained offensives to secure control. Both sides recognized that Afghanistan's conflict was unlikely to be resolved quickly, and the coming winter would test the endurance and resilience of all involved. By the end of November 1981, the situation was fragile. Soviet forces maintained control over major urban centers and vital transportation routes, yet insurgent influence persisted in rural and mountainous regions. The PDPA government remained heavily dependent on Soviet military support, struggling with internal factionalism, public distrust, and persistent guerrilla resistance. Civilians continued to face dire conditions, with refugee flows, food shortages, and disease showing no signs of abating. Autumn of 1981 revealed that the war in Afghanistan was entering a phase of prolonged attrition, with the harsh realities of winter poised to exacerbate the human and military toll. The winter of 1981 descended over Afghanistan with unrelenting severity, blanketing the Hindu Kush, the Central Highlands, and even lower plains with frost, snow, and bone-chilling winds. By early December, temperatures in the high mountains routinely dropped below -10 degrees Celsius at night, while snowdrifts blocked narrow passes and isolated entire valleys. The onset of winter transformed Afghanistan's rugged terrain into both a strategic challenge and an operational hazard for Soviet forces, Afghan government troops, and the resilient Mujahideen fighters. Soviet command quickly adapted to the changing environment. The Red Army fortified key urban centers such as Kabul, Herat, Kandahar, and Mazar-e-Sharif. Military engineers deployed to construct snow-resistant bunkers, heated barracks, and winterized supply depots. Supply convoys were rerouted to avoid avalanche-prone mountain passes, while Mi-8 helicopters were pressed into service to transport critical ammunition, rations, and medical supplies to isolated garrisons. Despite these precautions, winter conditions strained logistical networks. Vehicles frequently became immobilized in snow, roads were blocked, and communications lines were disrupted by ice and high winds. The Mujahideen, highly familiar with the terrain, exploited the winter conditions to their advantage. Small, mobile units moved along hidden mountain trails and river valleys, conducting ambushes against poorly defended convoys. Their intimate knowledge of the local geography allowed them to survive in snow-covered highlands where mechanized forces struggled. Guerrilla fighters used caves, abandoned homes, and snow-covered ridges to shelter from aerial reconnaissance and patrols, while stockpiling captured weapons and supplies. By mid-December, insurgent groups effectively controlled several northern and eastern provinces, including Kunar, Nuristan, Paktia, and parts of Baglan, using the harsh winter to consolidate their influence. Civilians faced unprecedented hardships. Thousands of families were trapped in snowbound villages, often with insufficient food, firewood, and warm clothing. Refugee camps swelled in Pakistan and Iran, with displaced families enduring freezing temperatures, disease, and malnutrition. Children suffered most acutely as winter illnesses spread rapidly in overcrowded shelters. Local testimonies painted a bleak picture. We had to melt snow for water and eat what little grain we could find. Our children's hands and feet were frostbitten, and we had no medicine. The wind howled constantly, and every night we prayed we would survive until morning. Soviet aerial operations faced severe limitations. Harsh weather reduced visibility and made helicopter flights perilous. Mi-24, Hind gunships and transport helicopters often risked severe turbulence and icy conditions to resupply frontline units or insert troops for winter patrols. MiG-21 sorties were curtailed due to poor visibility and the high probability of mechanical failure in freezing conditions. Soviet commanders balanced the need for continued pressure against insurgents with the reality of human and mechanical attrition caused by winter. On the ground, the Afghan army suffered alongside its Soviet allies. Morale was low due to extreme cold, constant attacks, and lack of adequate winter gear. Desertions increased as soldiers abandoned garrisons to seek shelter and food in their home villages, often joining local insurgent groups. By early January 1982, intelligence reports indicated that the Afghan army had lost nearly 40% of its effective manpower in northern and eastern provinces, exacerbating the government's reliance on Soviet forces. Fighting intensified despite the winter. Ambushes and skirmishes persisted along key supply routes. In early December, a Soviet convoy attempting to deliver supplies to the Salang Pass was targeted by insurgents using improvised explosive devices and mortars, resulting in significant casualties and destruction of vehicles. Soviet reconnaissance units responded with artillery strikes and aerial bombardment, but the insurgents had already dispersed into the surrounding mountains. Such encounters demonstrated the insurgents' resilience and the difficulty of controlling Afghanistan's terrain under winter conditions. Political maneuvering within the PDPA continued. Babrak Karmal, constrained by factionalism, relied heavily on Soviet advisors to formulate winter strategies. Hardline members pushed for aggressive sweeps in insurgent-held valleys, while moderates advocated for negotiations with tribal elders to secure local compliance. The Soviets, cautious of escalating civilian casualties and international criticism, often intervened to balance military pressure with attempts to maintain administrative stability. Internationally, the conflict continued to draw attention. The United States, China, Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan maintained support for the Mujahideen, sending additional weapons, funds, and training. Reports of Soviet military operations and civilian suffering in Afghanistan fueled global criticism, with Western media describing the situation as a humanitarian crisis. Within the Soviet Union, the Politburo debated the strategic value of continued military presence, weighing the risk of prolonged engagement against the need to maintain influence over Afghanistan. Civilian narratives from winter 1981 illustrate the human cost. We huddled in an abandoned schoolhouse, using blankets to keep warm. The snow outside was deep, and food was nearly gone. We could hear the sounds of distant fighting helicopters and gunfire, but there was no escape. We prayed for relief that never seemed to come. Winter also forced tactical adjustments. Soviet patrols relied more on small, well-equipped units rather than large convoys to reduce vulnerability to ambushes. Minesweepers cleared paths through snow-blocked roads, while reconnaissance drones and spotters provided early warning of insurgent activity. Afghan government forces, often poorly equipped for winter, increasingly depended on Soviet support for mobility, medical care, and coordination. By the end of December 1981, the conflict remained unresolved. Soviet forces maintained control over major urban centers and critical supply corridors, but insurgent influence continued in the rural and mountainous regions. Civilians endured harsh winter conditions, displacement, and violence. The stage was set for a protracted conflict into 1982, as the Red Army, the Afghan government, and the Mujahideen adapted to the challenges of winter warfare, each side enduring the toll of the cold, isolation, and relentless combat. The winter of 1981 gradually receded, giving way to the early signs of spring in Afghanistan. By March, melting snow revealed the rugged terrain of the Hindu Kush and the valleys of the northeast, exposing the paths that Mujahideen fighters had used to hide throughout the harsh winter. The Red Army and Afghan government forces anticipated that the thaw would bring renewed insurgent activity, as guerrilla fighters, reinforced and resupplied, emerged from mountain hideouts to reclaim territory and strike at supply routes. Kabul experienced the first warm days in March 1982. Though the air remained sharp and dry, the city, heavily fortified since the Soviet invasion, showed signs of wear from continuous military operations. Buildings bore scars from rocket and artillery fire, and streets were lined with checkpoints manned by Soviet and Afghan soldiers. Civilians navigated carefully, aware that any movement outside designated areas could lead to inspection, detention, or worse. Food prices, already inflated due to disrupted trade, increased further with the arrival of spring, as fresh supplies remained limited. The Soviet command prepared a series of offensive operations designed to suppress insurgent activity in the rural and mountainous regions. Operation Spring Thaw, as it was internally called, involved coordinated sweeps through key provinces in the northeast and east. Soviet airborne units were dispatched to secure high passes and river valleys, while mechanized infantry and Afghan army brigades moved along main roads to flush out insurgent strongholds. Helicopter reconnaissance and Mi-24 gunships provided close air support, often engaging in combat with fighters armed with mortars, recoilless rifles, and increasingly sophisticated anti-aircraft weapons supplied through Pakistan and Saudi Arabia. By mid-March 1982, intelligence indicated that insurgent activity had intensified in Kunar, Nangarhar, and Paktia provinces. Local Mujahideen commanders, operating semi-independently, coordinated ambushes against supply convoys and targeted isolated garrisons. One notable ambush in the Konar Valley saw a convoy of 30 vehicles attacked by a force of fewer than 50 fighters, who used the terrain and precise timing to disable the vehicles and escape without significant losses. Soviet after-action reports noted that the insurgents had become increasingly adept at avoiding airstrikes and exploiting the limits of mechanized mobility in narrow mountain passes. The Afghan government, under Babur Karmal, faced mounting pressure. Factional disputes within the PDPA persisted, particularly between hardliners who advocated aggressive purges of perceived opponents and moderates who sought stability through tribal negotiations. Karmal relied heavily on Soviet advisors to mediate these tensions, though local resentment toward the PDPA's violent methods undermined any attempts at lasting reconciliation. Efforts to engage tribal elders in the Northeast achieved limited success, as distrust of government authority and Soviet intervention remained pervasive. Civilian populations continued to bear the brunt of the conflict. Displaced families began returning to villages as roads cleared, only to encounter destroyed homes, mines, and unpredictable security conditions. Food shortages persisted, and medical facilities remained scarce and poorly equipped. Reports from humanitarian workers highlighted the vulnerability of women and children, with disease and malnutrition widespread in both rural areas and refugee camps along the Pakistan border. Internationally, the Soviet occupation continued to draw criticism. The United States, China, and Saudi Arabia escalated support for the Mujahideen. The CIA increased covert aid programs, including the provision of Stinger missiles and anti-tank weapons, aiming to level the playing field against Soviet helicopters and armored units. Pakistan's ISI coordinated closely with these efforts, training fighters and directing supplies to strategic areas. The growing flow of arms and funds emboldened insurgent groups, encouraging more coordinated and bold operations. Spring weather enabled the Soviets to conduct large-scale operations that had been impossible in winter. Artillery barrages preceded ground assaults designed to clear insurgent positions along key transportation routes. Helicopter-borne troops inserted into contested valleys faced intense resistance, with fighters employing hit-and-run tactics, mines, and ambushes to harass the advancing column. Despite technological superiority, Soviet units encountered logistical challenges as vehicles became bogged down in thawing terrain, and supply lines remained vulnerable to constant harassment. The PDPA, aware of declining popular support, attempted to implement limited reforms to regain legitimacy. Government officials distributed food rations in urban centers, reopened some schools closed during winter, and conducted propaganda campaigns to promote the benefits of modernization and social programs. However, the deeply rooted religious and tribal structures in rural areas resisted these efforts. Insurgent leaders capitalized on the PDPA's unpopularity, presenting themselves as defenders of Islam and Afghan tradition, which further undermined government influence. Throughout March and April 1982, numerous engagements highlighted the evolving nature of the conflict. In one instance, Mujahideen fighters seized control of a small district in the Kunar province, holding it for several days before a combined Soviet-Afghan operation retook the area. Casualties on both sides were significant, with reports indicating hundreds of fighters and civilians killed during clashes. Observers noted that insurgents had refined their tactics, blending conventional ambushes with psychological warfare to disrupt government and Soviet morale. Soviet and Afghan forces also faced internal strain. Harsh operational tempo, high casualties, and continued logistical difficulties led to decreased morale among troops. Desertions within the Afghan army remained a persistent issue, with soldiers either returning to their villages or defecting to local insurgent groups. Soviet commanders implemented rotations and additional training to maintain operational effectiveness, but the human cost of prolonged conflict was apparent. By late April 1982, spring had brought a temporary thaw in weather, but no reduction in hostilities. Both sides adapted to the changing environment, with insurgents exploiting open terrain for mobility and ambushes, while Soviet and Afghan units reinforced fortified positions and critical infrastructure. Civilians continued to navigate a landscape marked by destruction, fear, and uncertainty, their lives deeply affected by the intersection of geopolitics, ideology, and the harsh realities of war. The spring of 1982 marked a critical phase in Afghanistan's ongoing conflict. The Red Army maintained control of major cities and supply corridors, while insurgents expanded influence in rural and mountainous regions. The PDPA struggled to assert authority, constrained by internal divisions and widespread resistance. International involvement increased, setting the stage for a protracted and increasingly complex conflict that would endure for years to come. Winter had ended, but the war in Afghanistan showed no signs of abating. The delicate balance of power between Soviets, Afghan government forces, and the Mujahideen remained in flux, with spring ushering in new operations, strategies, and humanitarian crises. As the land slowly greened, the people of Afghanistan faced another year of uncertainty, resilience, and survival, amid one of the most challenging conflicts of the late 20th century.